Hello everyone. This is my first video following the intro video, and today we're going to be exploring some of my political views. And I'm just going to be presenting it by reading off of a paper I had submitted to a third-year political science course at a Canadian university, and yeah, just follow along with me and see what I got to say and it also speaks to my personal history as well. You know how my phase with nationalism and how it had helped me tackle some things that that I had basically inherited, right? Particularly religious dogma. So it served for me as like an antidote against religious dogma. But later on in my life, I had to end up basically denouncing that antidote as well, particularly nationalism. So check out my paper here, and I will you will get a sense of that. My basically disillusionment with nationalism. You get a hint of that by seeing in this paper. So here we go. This one is called Emancipate the Law from Nation, Experience of Minorities with Institutional Racism and the Importance of the Impartiality of Law. All right, and here I go. In the field of law and also in the field of medicine, scholars and their pupils seem to try to acknowledge or recognize, learn, and perhaps even apply some of the lessons of classical knowledge whenever it's germane. Yet this seems to be entirely absent in the study and practice of politics, and this was the observation of one of the most significant figures of the Renaissance period, Niccolò Machiavelli. Politics suffers from amnesia. In this paper, we intend to do exactly as he advises, i.e., in order to understand the current day trends facing the country, we will look back into history to see whether these trends had been present before. Although we're not going as far back as ancient history, but certainly the nascent period in this country's history. In the course of this paper, we will try to first see how deeply seated has become the conception of the nation and whether it is of any real significance for one's individuality. Second, we look at the experience of the minority groups that reside in this country and how institutions may have been skewed against them. And finally, we will take a dive into political theory in order to understand not only the reasons for the basis of law, but also how it can be corrupted and turned into an instrument of plunder. The concept of nation, that which many of us have attached so much significance to, this conception has sort of been ingrained in us, and it had become an inviolable part of our identity, and no one dare insult one's nation. But once we observe objectively the history of our people, our region, or humanity in general, we come to realize and acknowledge the truth that many of us for long have suppressed, that the nation is merely an artifact or a fabrication. So much had we fought for it, defended it, promoted it, and sought even the purity, the epitome, the paragon that best embodied the nation. But only with knowledge, wisdom, and great difficulty do we come to realize that the conception of a nation is a farce. That is, being someone being your compatriot does not automatically indicate that they're noble in pursuit or nature as you had hoped they are. Your compatriots do not stand on some kind of a pedestal above everyone else in morality and virtue. Rather, it seems that all the imperfections and blemishes of human nature is again present in the people of your nation, just like they are in any other. But for a man of this sort of ardor, it certainly is no easy to shed off the passion for his nation, since it had been ingrained in us. A man must undergo incredible, arduous journey to question the roots of his passions, because it is exactly that. He had thought that this nation had formed the foundation of his identity, and thus if the substratum is unstable, so could come crumbling down all the other blocks of his identity that had come after it. So many poems, energy, and time in general had been invested in glorifying this artifact, So much bloodshed the world has witnessed simply due to this artifact. Hence, the unquestioned enamor for the nation is simply an irrational fervor like any other, and history shows that it is potentially a deadly one. Same goes for the religious, as in caliphates, theocracies, etc., and the ideological, as in communism, fervor. They are all merely passions which could potentially boil up in men and arm him with the passion to be able to do serious harm. Another way in which nationalism could recede in a man is when he realizes how a nation comes to be. That is, in that its origins, the designation of certain territories to certain peoples, is quite arbitrary. Yet with the persistent inculcation of this mythology, the man starts to unquestionably identify with certain demarcated, official or in the irredentical sense, borders and also thereby their demonym or the nationality that supposedly rightly belongs in the territory. As recently as the early 20th century, this process could be seen as it was taking its burgeoning steps in Africa. Nationalism simply seems sorry. Nationalism seems to simply engender yet more nationalism, as some groups may have been ill assimilated into the larger nation, and instead end up forming a resistance to this force. This has certainly been the experience in Canada between the English and French. Those who had adequately resisted assimilation would start demanding their own state, so that they could go on to propagate the myths of their own nation, as they would have the biggest bullhorn in their jurisdiction. Pierre Trudeau, when writing on this matter, described such a revolutionary pursuit as a self-destructive end, because even if a minority had managed to split off the majority nation to form their own nation-state, they will soon discover that there is a minority within them too, who may also then demand independence. This thing goes on and on. This renders the image as the many shells of a set of nesting dolls, but likening the image to the to to the shells of this sort of a doll is significant in another way. That is, that not only societies could comprise within itself various layers of nations, but also that the individual likewise is made up of various layers in his identity, hence nationality being merely one of them. But yet when an individual is born into this world, other than the subtle physical variations in race, he is free of nationality, and thus we may conclude as such that nationality is part of the nurtured aspect of an individual, and not one that is innate. To take it a step further, nationality is part of the nurtured aspect of an individual. Oh, sorry. To take it a step further, one must consider the dichotomy between the inner world and the outer world, as the great Mike Tyson once pointed out, and that is that all the aspects of an individual, like family, nation, uh, hobbies, etc., are all forms as part of the outer world, but yet in the inner world, in the Atman, if you will, all those attributions or ascriptions are alien. That is, in that they are conceptions originally and rightly belonging in the temporal realm. The following two quotations also speak to this tone. So check out footnote 7. I made a reference to Mike Tyson's podcast, amazing podcast. You guys should check it out. And then I share two quotes, or I reference two quotes, um, and I proceed. Nationalism does not aim at liberty or prosperity, both of which it sacrifices to the imperative necessity of making the nation the mold and measure of the state. Its course will be marked with material as well as moral ruin, in order that a new invention may prevail over the works of God and the interests of mankind. By Lord Acton. And then a second quote, what we must know is whether man is intended to fill a predetermined role in history, whether history encompasses man, or whether man possesses innate powers which transcend all historical forms of culture and civilization. The question is whether it is not a denial of man's dignity to reduce him to mere identification with any particular mass of humanity. And that's a quote by Father Delos. And I continue. If it had been historically true that once an area had come to be occupied by many nations, that the law and the institutions had treated all individuals equally regardless of their nationality, that is, by the bare fact that they are a person and have their body, liberty, and property protected by the state, then perhaps there would have been no need for tensions to develop as they did. But yet the instigation of nationalism has again only resulted in engendering counter-nationalism. The law and the institutions did not perceive individuals to be one and equal. Instead, in many instances, it oppressed some and restrained their participation in society, and thus the contributions that would have been gained from their participation was simply thwarted. That has especially been the case in Canada with the experience of its minority groups like the Indigenous and the Francophones. Especially concerning the latter, had there been no barriers to their participation, there is no reason why their assimilation, not intended in the negative connotations that the word induces nowadays, but simply meaning the transformation of a group as being one apart from society to being one part of society, could not have gone as smoothly as, say, the French in Louisiana. You do not hear of any Franco-separatist movements coming out of Louisiana, but that is what has exactly resulted with the French in Lower Canada, the nationalistic fervor. Such passion they had garnered against their rulers, that even an invasion by the state's nemesis was to them not entirely threatening, and perhaps they would have even welcomed it. Though the tensions are often supposed as being between the English and the French, but yet it seemed to be progressively true that the interests of the French and the English populace was increasingly quite similar. But there was one major factor that prevented the mass to realize that their interests had been one and the same. It seems that their politicians had been the culprit, that is, that their purported representatives seemed to have captured race as a political tool. Yet it was quite an effective one, as politicians would put race front and center of all discussion, and so had the mass duped into thinking that this is what was setting them back, and this basically then created animosity between the French and the English populace. This is the classic divide and rule strategy, and hence it was in the interest of the politicians to keep the mass ignorant. In this way, they were more tractable and malleable. The experience of the indigenous was similar if not worse, and this is why they are constantly demanding group rights, more so in the sense of external protection, because minority groups do not wish to take part in the system that had been on record clearly rigged against them. It seems like the problems of society had been evident for the populace of various nations, but the source of the problem remained a mystery. From this observation it seems that Marx had almost got it right, but ended up missing the mark far off, as the elaboration of his argument derived from misidentifying the ruling class. That is, it was not those who by their own merit succeeded with their enterprise, or those willing to live within their means and investing their savings to gain an interest, that is simply the cost of borrowing, who were the exploiters, but it was the kleptocrats who time and time and again are usually the culprit of society's major issues, because the livelihood of these people derived not from creating wealth, but by taking it. Even in the 21st century, same trends continue. Nationalism begets yet more nationalism, in this instance being used in the broad sense, that is identifying oneself with and also advancing the interests of a group, even if it means at the cost of the general population. As Ignatieff tells us that politics had become a constant recrimination between supposed victims and their suppressors, as now every group not only asks for recognition, but also rights specifically for itself. The state seems to have become like a general store where everyone goes to acquire rights for themselves. Perhaps a store is not even an accurate analogy, more like a food bank, while the taxpayer is on the hook to make up the funding to grant these so-called rights, but also then for the bureaucrats to facilitate their approval, as it ought to go through endless procedures and stages of red tape. The efforts and the victories of these rights revolutionaries do not seem like the most as the emancipation of these various groups, but more like the further fragmentation of the larger Canadian society. One would also be right in believing their inkling if they were to assume about whom would see these trends as an opportunity and look to capitalize on them. Well, the politicians, of course. One would have to hear them out only briefly to figure out that that is exactly the sentiment that they try to promote, and these trends are in general no different than what Lower Canada had experienced with their cultural divisions. As George Bernard Shaw once put it, the only lesson of history is that we have learned nothing from history. In order to get a more clear picture of what is taking place, let us consider the ideas of the great Friedrich Bastiat, who in his work The Law explains the purpose for which the law and government ought to serve. Thus, by first detailing the premises of the book, the relevance and even the resonance will come to surface regarding our own country's problems in the 21st century. If every man can lawfully protect his own body, freedom, and his liberty, does it not follow that these individuals can unite their forces in order to create a common force for the purpose of protecting these rights? But it does not logically follow that if a person cannot lawfully coerce on another's body, liberty, or property, then this common force is also limited in this exact way, because again, the common force is merely the organized combination of the individual forces, and it cannot be used for any other purpose. Thus that forms the basis of government. Let us now consider the law. Man can satisfy his wants through labor, which constitutes the accumulation of property, but he can also do so by seizing and consuming the products from the labor of others, and this constitutes plunder. Since man is a rational being, meaning that he will seek the easiest or the least painful way to achieve his desires, thus it follows that man will resort to plunder whenever plunder is easier than work. So then how must plunder be stopped? It stops when plunder is made more painful than work, and thus the purpose of law is made lucid, that is to protect property and punish plunder. But yet since the law necessarily needs force in order for it to be applied, it usually happens to be the case that the people who hold this power also then end up making the laws that govern society. And considering humans' nature want to avoid pain and to resort to the easiest way to achieve their desires, the law will be made perverse. That is, that they will be skewed in favor of the lawmakers. But the plundered classes, perhaps in some similar to the term proletariats, will eventually revolt, and they may someday also have a hand in making laws. But when the opportunity finally presents itself, they may remove the evil of plunder or do otherwise, as Bastiat elaborates. Men naturally rebel against the injustice of which they are victims. Thus, when plunder is organized by law for the profit of those who make the law, all the plundered classes try somehow to enter, by peaceful or revolutionary means, into the making of laws, according to their degree of enlightenment. These plundered classes may propose one of two entirely different purposes when they attempt to attain political power. Either they may wish to stop lawful plunder, or they may wish to share in it. Until that happens, the few practice lawful plunder upon the many. A common practice where the right to participate in the making of law is limited to a few persons. But then participating in the making of law becomes universal, and then men seek to balance their conflicting interests by universal plunder. Instead of rooting the injustices found in society, they make these injustices general. As soon as the plundered classes gain political power, they establish a system of reprisals against other classes. They do not abolish legal plunder. This objective would demand more enlightenment than they possess. Instead, They emulate their evil predecessors by participating in this legal plunder, even though it is against their own interests. It is as if it were necessary, before a reign of justice appears, for everyone to suffer a cruel retribution, some for their evilness and some for their lack of understanding. We have considered the intensity and zeal that the enamor of a nation could breed. We have considered Canada's past and how the institutionalization of this sort of partiality to one's kin can arouse counter-nationalism. And finally, we have considered in theory how law and institutions can be turned from the role of maintaining justice to becoming an instrument of plunder. And we perhaps most importantly been successful in fulfilling the goal of this paper, that was in looking and learning about the past in order to understand the present. Alright, that's it, guys, and here are my references if you want to check them out. Um, yeah, like, share, subscribe, and let me know what you think. If this thing grows and if it has potential, I'm willing to invest for better mic and better equipment.